Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from the Western Cape pod bunker located here in the heart of Cape Town, South Africa. This pod is presented to provide a platform and a voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It is dedicated to those individuals and community groups that are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. In today's Talking Transformation podcast, we hear from Brazilian architect and urban planner Claudio Azzioli. Claudio has worked for more than 4 decades in the practical and research fields, working across the world as a leading housing practitioner, program manager and academic. He's advised national governments, community-based organisations and more recently the UN Habitat. He's recognised and respected as a global authority on slum upgrading, and up until very recently he was the lead for the Housing Policy and Slum Upgrading Programme for the United Nations Human Rights Programme. I had the personal privilege of studying under Claudio way back in 2004 when he was the lead lecturer in an informal settlement and land regularisation programme at the Institute for Housing and Urban Studies in Rotterdam, Netherlands. We'll talk about that course and the reflections and the lessons learnt 15 years ago which are still as relevant today in addressing the problems of urbanisation, informal settlement and the servicing of land for community upgrading projects. Simply put, Claudio has been there, he's done that and he's worn the t-shirt. At the same time, he's brought a sense of humour and a deep sense of humility to the endeavours and the approaches that he advocates for. Closer to home, here in South Africa, he's a board member of the Centre for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa, who you'll know are friends of the Talking Transformation podcast and featured in episode 14. Claudio is much in demand, and in today's episode, we explore his proposition at a time when land invasions and informal settlement growth in response to COVID-19, the pressures of urbanisation and failing economies are being acutely felt here in South Africa and many other countries around the world. That pressure is mostly felt in the metropolitan areas here in South Africa. What can informal settlements offer cities at a time when supply and demand is adversely impacted by the impact of the pandemic? What is it that cities fail to learn and need to accept or adapt to in order to maximise opportunities? And how do these differ during and after the crisis? These are some of the themes that we try and consider and unpack in today's episode. We hope you enjoy the episode, and as always encourage your feedback through our social media platforms, including Twitter. You can find us at Talking Transfo and the number 1, or leave us a voice message on our voice message service on the Anchor podcast platform. Enjoy the episode. So it's just gone 8 o'clock here in Cape Town and many kilometres away up in the Netherlands. I'm absolutely delighted to have on the line with us Claudio Azzioli. Claudio, how are you keeping? What's keeping you busy today and what you've been up to?
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for inviting me for this conversation about a theme which lies very strong in my heart and in my professional history, which leads to housing and slum upgrading and the future of cities through these interventions. Well, the things that keep me busy relates to the topic of our conversation. Actually, after 12 years leading the housing policy, the UN Housing Rights Program, and the housing policy works, the slum upgrading and capacity building in UN Habitat based in Nairobi, but working globally, being very fortunate to work with various teams of colleagues and experts from different places and countries, and developing some very interesting policy pieces and guidelines for UN Habitat that have been adopted and followed in many places of the world. Leaving that 31st of December 2019, so roughly 6 months ago, I moved into a new level of engagement through GIZ as their senior manager leading the European Union International Urban Cooperation Program for Latin America and the Global Covenant of Mayors for Latin America. So 2 legs program bringing the European experience to Latin America and vice versa. And I stayed there for about 5 months. And with the pandemics and the changes and shifts taking place from mid-March onwards, I started to think about that was time to regroup and rethink about what is that, where my contribution could be much more useful and strengthened. And I started to see that in the big favelas in Rio and São Paulo, some very interesting self-organized initiatives were being put in place, creating a very creative, innovative response to the pandemics without the state, because the state was not present in these areas. And I started to deep dive into what is happening in our cities when you take away the population and take away the economy of agglomeration. What happens to people and the urban economy? People who live in informal areas suffer double because they earn their income from the economy of the agglomeration, and they were pushed to be in inadequate housing, overcrowded, in very bad conditions, with the woman-headed households, which are in Brazil, nearly half of the population are households in these areas are headed by women. They depended on the economy of agglomeration to earn their income, and the school for the welfare and food for their children. So with that, they didn't have the income, they didn't have the food, so the impact on women were very dramatic in all the informal areas in Brazil. And on the other side was that housing and access to adequate housing became more exacerbated the problem. So with people not being able to pay their rents because they couldn't earn their daily income, and you see an increase in people living on streets, so a lot of evictions taking place, and you see the translation of the housing and urban development problem very much latent as a result of, I would say, the pandemic put it in a naked environment. So these are the things, and then a lot of organizations are calling upon my thinking and my suggestions and experience to think through about what is the city that will emerge after the pandemics. And then my thinking, as you asked me, what keeps me busy is that how these things link. So how do you link the housing with sustainable urbanization, which is necessary because the pandemics also show that once you take away people from public space and agglomeration, all of a sudden, the footprint of emissions of cities dramatically decreased. We saw some aerial photographies showing this dramatically. I started to really think through, what is that we need to do once the pandemic is over? Because if we continue doing what we have been doing until now, we know the result already. My point of departure is that before the pandemics, we had a global affordability crisis. We had the data in UN Habitat, the demographics showed the crisis in several places in Asia. So we had data that sustained each other, showing that people could not afford through the market. So purchasing a minimal standard house in their cities, it was above house price to income ratio 3. So using this indicator, so above that, it's beyond affordability. So in the majority of the 200 cities that UN Habitat created a database, that was the reality, but also rent. So rent was far above 25%. So people could not rent. They could not access through purchase or market transactions. So where do they go? Obviously, and then we saw the growth of informal development in many places of the world. And then the pandemics made this just exacerbated. And these are the things I'm I'm arguing that we can use the housing sector as the catalytic for social recovery and economic revitalization of the economy. So because of the interlinkage you have with the housing sector, with practically all the dimensions of the economy of a country, just name it, and you have an interface with housing sector, the construction, the employment, the financial industry, let's put it like that, the industrial housing finance, the entire construction industry, the land, the land supply, and then the infrastructure and all that. So I'm arguing that we could use in the housing sector as a catalytic for this recovery, but doing a different way, not in the old way that we've been doing so far, very traditional, I'm afraid. So these are the things I'm keep myself busy and talking to different parties and organizations about, including UN Habitat.
Well, you certainly seem very busy, and I say, I've been following your progress the last few months over the various social media, and you're a man much in demand. And as you say, whether it's the UN Habitat, whether it's the municipalities of Brazil and South America that you've been assisting with, the age-old issues are not going away, and I think it's more than 15 years since you taught me in our class that year in Rotterdam at the IHS. About these issues of informal settlement, the importance of land regularizations. And that was 15 years ago. And what seemed daunting then almost now seems impossible. And the notion that we can ever get to a situation whereby there is this universal or adequate housing accommodation for all it almost seems like a fantasy. How do you think we can start to tackle this issue now? You've described the issues of affordability. What do you think has really been the major shifts and changes, other than the quantum, I guess, since sort of 15 years ago?
The last session of the World Economic Forum had a conversation about affordable housing. And I was very surprised and very pleased too that one colleague who saw and followed the dialogue sent me a message, said, hey, your diagram is opening the dialogue here. And it's a diagram that I shared with you when you were in IHS, where I showed the idea of housing much more than houses, but infrastructure, land, supply, infrastructure, and then labor. And now I include the issue of planning and then legislation, the whole framework. So the issue that you say seems to remain is that, for example, in the part of housing finance, it has been very traditional and changing very little in all these years, including with the crisis that picked up in 2007, 2008 in the States. And we still continue to do in the same way, and assuming that people have an income, and then I set up my interest rates and I put a maturity time for a loan, and then people will have a loan and they purchase a house and they become owners. And then if they have a job, they can pay. If they don't have a job, there will be trouble. Or if the economy is indexed and the loan is indexed and you have inflation, you are in big trouble. And then very little on innovating, for example, understanding that a lot of people take time and they build housing incrementally. So why didn't we go to scale in a diversification of different programs that would allow different social economic groups or segments of the market, as some people prefer to call it, to have different products available for them by the housing finance industry. This has been very conservative and very difficult to change. And I'm very surprised for now that I see in Brazil, embedded in the changes that are being suggested, that we're going to securitization of the housing sector and the housing supply, which was one of the sources of the crisis in the US. So we bring in some old ideas that we know did not work that well under certain conditions. So this is one point. The other is that we discussed 15 years ago and continues to be a hot issue, and particularly for you who live in Africa, is the land, the availability of land, but not only land, serviced land in scale, because you can only tackle an alternatives to informal urbanization if you're able to deliver serviced land at scale. Because if you have that, you not only will plan better urbanization, but you also will indirectly encourage private investment, which means the supply side. So you need to look into housing in that perspective, and that brings me to the third point, is that traditionally housing has been very much placed in one box and urban planning and management in another box. And I've been arguing that you can't separate these things. It has to be part and parcel, because, and then I was pleased to see the outcome of the 200 cities sample of cities of the UN Habitat, which showed that, in all the cities, the average is 55% of the land cover of the urbanized areas of the cities are covered by housing and residential use, which means whatever you do in housing, you change the legislation, you change the typology, you change the occupancy rate or the floor area ratio, you will have a tremendous impact on the city and its economy. That's the third point I mentioned, that you have to bring housing to the urban policy and the urban management of city. It has to be part and parcel and vice versa, because otherwise you repeat what, for example, Mexico did, where during a period of 12 years, producing something like between 400 and 650,000 units per year, they realized that they were producing housing, but they were not producing cities, because these were enclaves in cheap land located very far away from the city core. The investments in housing moved from 7 kilometers from the city center to 37 kilometers. So these became like townships, with only housing use, where people were obliged to go out to get income or to buy their basic needs. That is a very dramatic example that when you dissociate these two, you create these nightmares that they had to shift completely the policy when the government changed. And the paradox of everything is that while they were producing all that, informal housing in core locations were also increasing. So people seem to even abandon their housing and moved into nearby areas where they could earn the income. To a point, Peter, that, for a place like South Africa, where you went to a significant scale there in production since the democratization and the fall of the apartheid regime, in Mexico, after all that, they discovered that they had 4.990, I say it's around 5 million housing units abandoned, semi-occupied, vandalized. The images are incredible when you see the needs around Mexico and also in other parts of the world. We seem to continue doing policies and strategies that have been proven not to work. And when I said in the beginning about the land, in Africa is particularly serious, and the Center for Affordable Housing Finance, based in Johannesburg, issues every year an incredible yearbook with all the data, and they're showing that a very tiny percentage of African citizens are able to afford a housing that is offered in the market, with an average price among all these countries around $31,000. Now, this is a standard housing in these countries. And then when you look at the land supply, in many countries, you have the customary land ownership coexisting with, let's say, the Roman law-based kind of property rights regime, which creates a nightmare for investors and, for example, the African Development Bank, which hardly goes into the urban areas like the Inter-American Development Bank that goes into housing and urban projects. But the ADB, the African Development Bank, seem to avoid that. And I think one of the reasons that, the land is so hot that you don't know who is going to claim that land once you do something on top of it.
There's at least 4 different dimensions that you've talked about. There's the question of the scale, the ability to assemble land at scale. The location of that land is important. The services that you put into that, the pipes, the roads, the schools, the clinics that support that. And there's the 4th part being the legal premise that you're now talking about. All of that, I guess, adds to this amazing complexity in the system. The question, I guess, is where in your experience, which are the cities, which are the countries that seem to be doing, to addressing at least one of these 4, if not more of these 4, the best in terms of their adaptability, their flexibility in their approaches, and that diversity in typology that I think you also alluded to, Claudio?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question because it might lead your audience to believe that either I'm out of place because I'm giving examples that don't fit, or they're so specific that they don't help me. But I think that I've been someone who has promoted a lot what I call cross-fertilization, which means, since you are from South Africa and you've been here, in the beginning we received here groups from South Africa, in the beginning from SAMCO and from other NGOs and practitioners. The idea was to create massive capacity and getting them trained to take over responsibilities in different places in the government administration. So then we made agreements with the municipality of Rotterdam to allow these groups to go there and work with the planners, architects, engineers, in different departments, so that how that particular administration works. Of course, that it's a different reality, but then if you're able to place yourself in the position of those public servants, that architects, engineers, lawyers, social work, environmental, they're working different, and then see the methodologies or the approach they use, how they organize certain things, then you can adapt and transform that and bring to your own reality and then reinvent it. That is a way to transform and to change your own context. So with that in mind, I've seen in my life certain things that really marked my experience. I go back very far away, which was a program which was led by a colleague of mine in São Paulo, in a particular period of São Paulo, which managed to go to a significant scale and was inspiring other cities and other state areas in Brazil, and was the let's say the origin and the inspiration for the national policy program, which was a program called FUNACOM, of which community-based organizations that were organized groups of residents, they could receive technical assistance from a technical assistant group legally established and recognized by the municipality, and together they would propose projects, social housing projects, and acquire building materials, land, and specific technical assistance for piping, electricity, and so on. And 4% of the budget would be, let's say, to pay the technical assistance of architects, engineers. And it was amazing. And this was a game change. And the interesting is that this was inspired by the experience in Uruguay. And they had a national cooperative, housing cooperative law, which the dictatorship intervened completely and changed the law, because the law was allowing groups of organized, civil society groups organized, to not only create social housing in a cooperative way, but creating sustainable communities that were very cohesive. So they were generating a very powerful social force, which certain political groups did not like it at all. But it was an experience which was basically that. So they had a federation, then they organized the technical assistance groups, then they prepare and train the groups of population, which became cooperatives, and they built incredible quality housing with size, standard, design, and wow, good finishing. It was really inspiring. And then going to another scale, I could tell you that certain things that marked me, and then now looking from a different perspective, I think that what the Dutch did here from 1901, and if someone can study that properly and understand the steps they made to reach where they are, which is a significant part of the housing stock in rented occupation, which is a rental stock owned by housing associations, which are private entities that build for the social good. And there they acquire finance in the beginning by the state, and later on they became independent, and they went to the market to acquire their finance to produce certain amounts of social housing. It is a self-regulated sector in a way, which faced some problems, but they became the most powerful social entrepreneurs in Europe. In a certain moment, I remember that their asset was worth 92 billion euro. So if one of these housing associations go there and ask for a loan, you will get a good deal for
a blue chip investment.
Yeah. So they became bankable. And when you go in the cities here, you don't know whether that is private ownership or rental housing. And this comes to a point, Peter, that I want to just make a question to you, and we can come back to that. How do you explain that the richest countries in the world, the wealthiest countries in the world, have large parts of their housing stock in rented occupation, while the poorest countries are becoming nations or homeowners? How can you explain that? Okay, so that brings me to another very extreme example. I think I've been working in Korea and Singapore during my time in Habitat. And I think both countries, particularly Korea, was down to the ashes after the war. Income per capita was 350 or 400 dollars. 55 years later, they had an income per capita of $35,000. How did they do that? And one of the tools for the redevelopment was a massive investment in housing. They did a compulsory land acquisition. They implemented a very sophisticated land readjustment process to acquire land and create land readjustment projects where both the public and the private could benefit, but mostly the public taking the highest stake and the benefits to distribute to the society, access to social and affordable housing. And they went to an incredible depth to oversupply. Okay, did they make mistakes? Of course they made. Many of the countries I mentioned, nothing is perfect. But they show that if you set up a regulatory framework, if you set up the whole industry with a clear policy, and both actors, private, public, and institutional, playing their role, you can actually produce good results and deliver the scale and quality and location that you need to. And I think Singapore did something, and the scale is different than what we've been talking, because it's a city-state, but they were like with 1 million people living in quarters and shacks and this. You could see the situation, and they vanished that by a very integrated approach, which started with, they had a leadership and strong government. You may say that both Korea and Singapore, in a certain period, they had a very strong government, not so democratic as one would have expected. As time went by, they had to, because civil society emerged and started to demand rights. And so land could not be forcibly acquired through Land Acquisition Act. So they had to go to court and negotiate price. But in the very beginning, they set up that. They set up a planning scheme, and they set up something you see common in countries that went to scale: Brazil, Mexico, Singapore, the Netherlands. What is that? A national housing fund. They created what they call the Central Providence Fund. So with the compulsory contribution of employees and employers, so companies, etc. Same example in Brazil, same in Mexico, and here a bit different in the Netherlands. But creating that fund. In Brazil, they created more, let's say, in the 21st century, let's see, was it? So after 2000, the social housing fund, in addition to, let's say, the housing fund that existed there with the compulsory contribution. And then in the case of Singapore, they created an institution, the Housing Development Board, that was in charge of connecting the whole housing delivery scheme with the urban planning and the concept of, let's say, township development, in which they applied in the entire territory, which enabled them to recover a lot of their greenery and create more sustainability at the neighborhood level, in a very interesting model where you should have all your convenient demands satisfied within 500 meters from where you live. So you have the bakery, the butcher, the pharmacy, the
social amenities, your school, clinic, etc.
Yeah, so it was very interesting. So these are, different examples. And as I went around, then I saw the Philippines doing something similar to what the Dutch do, like, making the quota for social housing. So every private investment and housing development, you need to put a certain quota for social housing. So it's obligatory here. Now in the Philippines, they couldn't enforce the law. So entrepreneurs kind of cheated the law, but it was there. They had the community mortgage program, which was a huge success for a number of years because it connected the very low income with NGOs that use as the initiators of projects. So very similar to what you saw in Sao Paulo, and purchasing land and engaging in negotiations with landowners to purchase land to build social housing for the population they represented. Everywhere you find things that are innovative, creative, going out of the, let's say, of the curve, and creating a scale that allows this innovation to really be remarkable. And, we need to dig more into that so that we can cross-fertilize other places that are not connected to this.
I think what you've done there, Claudio, is you've given us such a wide and fascinating diversity of different geographic locations, different approaches that were used. There's a few commonalities that seem to run through that. And first thing is around sort of an institutional framework, a funding framework, and a very direct commitment to a series of, let's call them investment programs, backed by a sort of implementation framework. When we talk here in South Africa often about sort of new cities, and I think of that Singapore transition that you mentioned, the Rotterdams of the world, major rebuilds after the Second World War, etc. Here in Southern Africa, my sense is that when we talk about new cities and so forth, it's often seen through a very sort of rose-tinted glasses of, this idea of the fourth industrial revolution, shiny condominiums and mixed-use precincts where everything is very shiny and works, and often married with public transportation systems, which are something like out of Back to the Future, some amazing ideas. Whereas really, I think the reality of a lot of the new city that's been built in certainly our metropolitan areas in South Africa seem to be a lot more incremental by nature, a lot of sort of diversity in building techniques and approaches, smaller scale building that's going on. We've seen a lot of the old, let's call it RDP stock that has given way to 2-3 story walk-ups, basically cannibalized the original shell. And now we're seeing, multiple units under 2 or 3 story walk-ups. And that's, to my mind, is more and more the nature of one side of the new city approach. The second, I think, which has been quite a fundamental change, I'd be interested to get your take on it, as an outsider who's been always, interested, involved in South Africa, and having seen many students come through IHS and Rotterdam over the years, is at some stage South Africans would have talked about the eradication of informal settlements. It was a very sort of particular approach by the national government at one stage, and recognizing that much of the country over the post-democratic era has been the same ruling party at national, provincial, and many of the municipalities. That was a message that filtered down. Now what we're seeing is a much stronger commitment to the upgrading and the preconditions for the formalization or the regularization of these settlements. I'd be really interested to get your take. One on this idea of new city building and what it is and what the realities are that you've seen across the board. And there's this idea of your experience of the South African transition and perhaps journey from eradication to a far more greater acceptance that informal settlements are here to stay, and we need to, as you say, make sure the servicing is correct, there's a degree of tenure of security, and the whole national upgrading of informal settlement program here in South Africa is one of the now key cornerstones of where we are rebuilding the post-democratic South Africa.
Look, if we look at the history of cities, both in Europe, North America, and in Latin America and Asia, I'll come back to Africa, which comes a little bit late because of the pace of urbanization. You see very well that in the beginning, informal settlements, slums, favelas, whatever name it got, were seen as something totally unacceptable against public health and sanitary conditions. We need to wipe out this from the city and build good housing for these people and send them there. That was the policy, which is the eradication. Clean up, send them, the population, to wherever new location. The famous film, The City of God. I don't know if it's...
Of course. Yeah, I remember you showing us the opening scene back in class, back in the day. Amazing movie.
Yeah. So the City of God, is the result of a slum eradication policy in Rio de Janeiro in the end of the 60s, where these ideas were present, despite the fact that there was already in São Paulo and Rio some experience which counterbalanced this with recognizing the settlements and improving the settlements by providing services, doing urban planning, doing relocation, opening streets, etc., and creating a basis for people to develop in the location where they were. Then later on, programs were designed but very much based on projects. So one project upgrading here, one project there, but there was no common vision about the city with all these informal areas. And then the third generation came where people start thinking as citywide, how these areas connect to the rest of the city, what kind of programs. So many large-scale programs of upgrading, regularizations were put in place, and that became the norm of the day in Latin America and in Asia, and then coming a bit later in Africa. I happen to be responsible for the strategy that we developed for Habitat on how to do a citywide slum upgrading using the street-led citywide slum upgrading approach, which has been adopted in many places of the world. And also I've been working with that in many places where I worked as a practitioner, working with governments, not reinventing the wheel, but basically providing a basis for these areas with an area-based plan where you have the street network and you incrementally implement the street network that better connects these areas with the rest of the city and with the infrastructure network. And as the budget allows, you implement the area-based plan and you connect these areas that in 20, maybe 30, maybe more, they will become part and parcel of the city, because urbanization is a long term. But the moment you define the public domain, and that's the street, and that's the framework where public and private domain are defined, then you give chances for these areas to develop. I think the big mistake that people are continue to do is to do upgrading as just going there without a plan, just put some drainage, put some water supply, and then give condition. Then some even do the security of tenure, give a document or even a title without having a plan for these areas. So you create a big nightmare for the city and a very difficult situation, costly for the population to regularize. I think this is for me, and I've been really hammering on that. If we go to do that, we need to go to scale. We need citywide, do the area-based plan, and use the street-led to allow these areas to connect to the rest of the city, because it's a physical plan intervention, looks like, but you actually created the conditions for land regularization and economic development. Because the moment you connect, then you also have the mobility issue being resolved, because then you start having, perhaps in some areas, even public transport coming inside the areas, because you have accessibility and let's say a rational way of circulating, transporting the areas, depending on the size it is. Okay, so this is one thing. About the future of the city or the new town, don't forget I was the first 5 months of this year, I was in Brasilia, so the creme of la creme for urban planners and architects in terms of new town. But I want to go back to something, and I don't know how is it unfolding in Africa, but what I observe in Latin America and what I'm observing here is that it is likely that the city post-pandemic will have a significant amount of office space redundant. What it means is that big enterprises have realized that they don't need 10,000 square meters to function efficiently. They can have people sitting elsewhere, having a small headquarters or a satellite of small office where people have open space, a plug-in with their laptop if they need, when they need to work in network on a project, on something, because nowadays the platforms that are allowing for people to design even cooperatively being in different places of the world is a reality. We could have And in Brazil, is this discussion, we could have an enormous amount of office spaces available in the inner city. And inner city in Latin American cities are already significantly empty, with a lot of abandoned buildings and derelict land. And in some cities, programs to retrofit and transform into social housing is underway. And there is a big concern that after pandemics, this will be a problem that will become an opportunity, which means retrofitting and providing more housing opportunities for different groups in the inner city, which will help to revitalize the city. And I hope that they will not commit the same mistakes that Rotterdam did in the post-war, which was to concentrate all the housing, which means to bring people back to the inner city, so housing, but it was only social housing. And only after the 90s, as they realized that that was not a good policy, and they started diversifying the supply of housing types, so private, different size, and also rental and mixed tenure in buildings, really a diversity that created very dynamic economy in the inner city of Rotterdam, where a lot of the GDP is generated. It's really interesting to see. So this could be one of the things. And the other thing I didn't speak, Peter, which I forgot about it when I spoke about housing, is the mobility. Because as you mentioned, housing is also location, because without land, we can't build houses, we can't build cities. So land is also location. So the connection between housing, planning, land, and location is about the public transport. People want to live closer to their jobs where they earn their income. The less mobility in terms of distance and time you have, the more efficient the city will be. And that brings us to the last point I think I would like to say is about the emissions. The reason why cities are contributing to 40% of all the, actually it's more, the data I saw is like 70% of the emissions come from cities, which means of which something like 40% comes from housing and construction. So that means if you connect housing, planning, transport, supply of planned land, again, bring in the planning, you might create something that people are, I read some people talking about, we need to sprawl, the city is too crowded, that's why the virus is spreading. Man, the future of cities, I believe, will be a sustainable, compact, and well-connected cities. And all these disaster and catastrophic prognoses that people are giving because of the pandemics, it was giving in all the plagues, in all the sanitary crisis that cities had, and cities came out and reinvented itself. And why? Because the concentration of people and economic development, if it's well planned, it will become sustainable. And this agglomeration of minds and souls create innovation, transformation, social development, and political changes. And the future is there. I don't believe in these recipes that some people are saying that we're now going to the countryside because we don't want the virus and we want to rediscover nature. We are Homo urbis, and we were Homo sapiens, but we are Homo urbis because that's where the changes take place. That's where society has advanced. And the Dutch prime minister some time ago said, luckily we have a compact urbanization in cities so that all the infrastructure is available, so people don't need to go very far to access basic services. If you plan well and if you keep your balances in place, things become more accessible for everybody because optimally use in terms of finance and use of land. I am one of those who believe that the future is a well-connected, compact cities, sustainable, with low emission, recycling its solid waste, and creating different ways of mobility and accessibility. And let's not forget different types of housing, different materials and different solutions that do not generate too much carbon for the causing so harm to the planet.
Claudio, thank you for going into so much depth and really shaping the discussion. As we work towards a conclusion, maybe just your thoughts on the role of major organizations. You've mentioned UN Habitat, the World Bank, obviously the World Health Organization playing a major role. So on the one hand, the big organizations who are, let's call it the global players, and you've been involved with some of these. And on the other side, the role of the academic institutions, which you've also had a major hand in.
I always say that the problem we find in cities is not a government problem. It is a problem of society, which the government plays a role, but all the other actors as well. The social organizations, institutions that play their function, universities. The more engaged the universities, and they should be engaged in the communities where they are located. I've been, since my student movement time, we were always struggling for the university connected to society so that we could best serve the needs of the population through knowledge, through research, for development techniques and all that. So that's obvious. The other not so obvious is the international organizations. And I think the international organizations can play a role by bringing the global issues and global agenda to local and bringing the local to the global. So creating these synergies, making access to other sources of funds, other sources of knowledge, and promoting exchange, stimulating innovation where they are taking place, and then bringing that innovation to other places of the world. So creating this cross fertilization through what we call best practice or good practices, sustainable practice. People are now getting an issue about best practice, but I think best practice has been such a jargon that people understand today that they're best for that moment and that context and can be, let's say, adapted to other contexts. We are in a very specific moment of our human history, particularly thinking that in some places, as we speak, someone is losing a father, a mother, or a brother, or a grandfather, or a sister, because the number of deaths per day is incredible. In Brazil, as you're following, there was a moment that every minute of the day, there was one Brazilian dying. So this is not a joke. And the World Health Organization play its role, but it cannot do alone. It needs the national, the local, and the provincial governments and civil society organizations that are operating there to make certain things work. I believe that if you say, it's a government's responsibility, then, we won't go very far with that, because governments are not able to deliver alone a number of things. It depends on others. And that brings me to one last issue that became for me very clear in this pandemics. In the case of Brazil, the mayors, because in Brazil, the municipalities have constitutionally protected autonomy. Mayors are elected, vice mayors are elected, municipal council, by the population. Everybody above 16 years old can vote. So they are accountable, and they have 5 major sources, their own finance. They don't depend on anybody, and above the mayor, only the law. There is no president, no governor, nothing. So if you're a mayor, you have to run your city with your team and your municipal council and your technical experts. So what we saw in Brazil during the pandemics is municipalities taking the lead, so the local level. And city of Niterói, for example, on the other side of the Bay of Rio, they used a sovereign fund that they were building through their royalties of the petroleum. So they had a huge fund that they were building for the next generation. So they used that fund to create, let's say, buffer funding to support small-scale enterprises. So a deal that if they would not fire their employees, they would get a minimum income for each employee up to 9 people out of their 19, because that was the maximum of to define the small-scale enterprises. They also put up a minimum income for the poor population, create a cadastre with an ID card, etc., and then everybody receiving a minimal income so that they could stay at home and have access to food, because they could use the fund to purchase food. And many innovations were taking place for planning, for creating more public space, engagement of the population, education, blah, 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 many things, all at the local level. So this brings us this, it's local to global, global to local, and a variety of institutions. Let's not forget, the corporate social responsibility has a huge role. It's not because they have the finance, but because they have experience with entrepreneurship, on project development, on making things work with minimal resources and getting the best output. So you bring these things in equation, and it requires a social pact and an economic pact. Without that, we will sink.
Claudio, on that note, I want to thank you very much for reminding me about some of the messaging from 15 years ago. And those are great times, and a reminder that some of the principles remain and that we need to keep kicking home some of those points, but also the diversity of the examples and the journey that you've taken us on this last hour. Thank you so much for your time and effort. Maybe just as a final thing, where can people find out more about the work that you've done and the work that you're doing? I think you've got your website, you're available on LinkedIn and so forth.
Yeah, I'm not very active on Facebook and LinkedIn. I just put there when certain things. I should have been more active. I've been very much in these last months a bit on the background, but most of the things I did is in my website, www.claudioacioli.com. There you find a lot of stuff, more the recent things I presented. It's all there.
Thank you. I'll make sure that we share the links in the various flyers and so forth that we put out. And really all the very best to you, your family, and the work that you're doing. In the meantime, Claudio, look after yourself and speak to you soon.
Thank you very much for the conversation, Peter. Good luck with your work. I know you engage in Joburg, and it's big challenges there. You have big responsibilities. I met a great team there, and I think you have a lot of good people there. Just get on.
Thank you. We'll do our very best. In the meantime, thank you, Claudio.
Okay.
Look after yourself. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.